Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another live edition of the Globe Radio Hour right here on the TruthNet Radio Network. My name is Josh Reeves. It's going to be coming to you live for the next hour. I got a great guest lined up today, big guest. One of the things we try to bring you on this program is information that pertains to everything far-reaching with the New World Order. And our guest today is going to be Professor Peter Dale Scott. Peter Dale Scott is a former Canadian diplomat and English professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He is a poet and writer and researcher. He was born in Montreal in 1929. He has written many books on the subject of the Kennedy assassination, including the War Conspiracy, the Assassinations, Dallas and Beyond, Crime and Cover-Up, the CIA, the Mafia, and the Dallas Watergate Connection, as well as co-authoring a book with David Ray Griffin, 9/11 and American Empire. He is an extremely well-versed researcher, and his newest book is The Road to 9/11, and it just came out. You can get that at Amazon.com. And he is going to sit with us for the next hour and discuss his new book as well as a great many other things. Professor Scott, thank you for being on the program with us today.
Well, I'm glad to be with you.
First, before we get too far into the program, Professor Scott, please give everyone a little bit of background that I might have missed there in my introduction reading off of your bio, and tell everybody a little bit about yourself and about your new book and, a few things of what you might like to discuss today.
I see. Well, you covered my bio pretty well, I think. As for the book, I start the book by talking about, as a Canadian, I came here, I thought, for 1 year to America. I'm in Berkeley, California, as I talk here. Thought I came for 1 year, loved California and stayed on, but I had a feeling akin to dismay when it became more and more obvious in early 2003 that George W. Bush was going to take us to war in Iraq, a country that so it was pretty obvious to me it wasn't going to work out well, and I think it's pretty obvious to everybody now that it hasn't worked out well. And but then I also felt that it wasn't all to be blamed on George W. Bush, because in a way the country had been building up to something like this for 40 years. And the book, which I'd actually begun before 9/11, is it's not so much a book about 9/11. It has 2 chapters about 9/11, but it's much more about how we've been moving towards more and more secrecy in foreign policy making, building more, giving more and more power to non-accountable institutions like the CIA and also the NSA, which has a far bigger budget than the CIA, but you don't hear as much about it. And feeling that the American Constitution is not a perfect one by any means, but it's lasted very well, helped create one of the most favorable conditions for living anywhere on the globe, and that it's now severely threatened by these moves towards secrecy and decision-making by small cabals who don't even consult the most expert people in the fields that they're making policy about. So that's the general idea of the book, is to make a case for going back to a more open and constitutional form of government and cut back, not abolish altogether, but radically cut back the powers of what I call the deep state, that's part of the state that isn't accountable to public institutions.
And that's some of the things that you get into in the book, is how far back that this has been occurring and how long they've been formulating these plans and these operations. I believe in your book you say it goes all the way back to World War II, and just the basic, the secrecy, like you said, in these cabals and in these small compartmentalized agencies within the federal government that seek to eviscerate the Constitution. And we had a report about 30 minutes ago that the hate crimes bill was passed through Senate today, which is another, First Amendment, eviscerating bill. Professor Scott, how long and how far-reaching in your research have you found this plan for global domination and the restriction of the U.S. Constitution on its people?
Well, I don't want to stress the word plan at first. I think what happened after World War II, you know, if I'd had enough space, I would have taken it back to World War I. But first of all, it's just an inevitable growth. It happened to Britain before us. It happened to Spain. When a country is well organized and progressive, it expands. And as it expands, as its influence moves out beyond its frontiers, it begins to develop institutions to deal with those aspects of society that are beyond the frontier, and this grows with time. It's not a plan at first. It is pretty much a plan by now, I think. In fact, it's not only a plan, but we had a public blueprint for it. Then the project for the new American century in the year 2000 came out with it was a blueprint for American unilateral domination of the rest of the world, for major budget increases in the military to make this possible. And then they actually said in this blueprint that it would be difficult to achieve this in democracy absent some new catastrophe like a new Pearl Harbor. And of course, the 9/11 catastrophe was exactly that. We wouldn't have the Patriot Act and all these various the warrantless detentions, warrantless eavesdropping, all these things. We wouldn't have it if it hadn't been for 9/11. So that's why in 2 chapters I make the case that the people who planned for this change of government were also involved in the, not totally responsible for, but need to be questioned about their responsibility for 9/11 itself.
Now, yesterday on my program, I was getting into a little bit, and you mentioned the Project for an American Citizen. And yesterday on the program here, I was covering the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations. And for my research, Professor,
my book.
I had found...
my book. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I had found that you know, much of what was going on in the early 20th century with the formation of the Council on Foreign Relations, with you know, not only Allen Dulles, but I believe was his father, some of the other people that were involved there. Much of what was formulating in the early 20th century with the formation of the League of Nations and the CFR was much what we see happening in the early 21st century with the Project for a New American Century documents, and as you said, their blueprint for what they plan to do in this century. Can you speak a bit to that?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, and I certainly, that my first chapter talks about the enormous influence which the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, had in the creation of the CIA, and actually there's a whole agenda that they successfully implemented in the 1940s when Harry S. Truman was president. The most conspicuous part of it, perhaps, is the CIA, but that was created under the new National Security Act. We got a new Department of Defense, which centralized the Army, Navy, and the new Air Force. It created a National Security Council, which itself is very important as a way of getting decision-making out of the cabinet and into a smaller body. And it's just incredible the extent to which this whole design for a new American foreign policy mechanism was really designed up on Wall Street by people in the Council on Foreign Relations. But what I show in my book, or try to show in my book, the difference between the Council on Foreign Relations then, back in the 40s and 50s, and what we have now, is that the CFR represented big banks, and it represented big banks, oil companies, but also industry, and we had a productive civil economy in those days. Starting about 1975 to 1980, it's increasingly imposed. You know, there's another opposition group to the CFR called the Council for National Policy, based in Dallas. And they are much more in tune with the policies of what we call PNAC, the Project for the New American Century, and of this Bush administration. The difference there is that they represent to a far greater degree what Eisenhower correctly labeled as the military-industrial complex. Back in the 50s, you had kind of a mix between civil economy and the defense economy, or the military-industrial complex. But with the changes that have happened since then, the civilian economy is much less important. The military economy is much more important, really has come to dominate Wall Street itself. And so the old CFR, I think, is not very powerful now, and the new CNP, ABC once called it the most powerful group you never heard of, because unlike the CFR, they operate almost exclusively in secret. We don't even know who their members are. Well, we know some of them. We do know that they are financed in part out of companies like Blackwater, which has been very much in the news recently, and in turn advance the agenda of what you might say the military-industrial complex itself.
And from what I found, you know, when you start looking into a lot of these groups, as you were saying, Professor, about the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, etc., most of these groups are funded and started by David Rockefeller as basically, special interest groups and think tanks to basically protect Rockefeller interests in specific companies. OPEC in Saudi Arabia comes to mind as one of the original plans for what the Trilateral Commission was trying to do, as well as take heat away from the Council on Foreign Relations. And when you have people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who founded the Trilateral Commission at Columbia University, you have these people in charge, and these people today, that they still write books and they still talk about what their plan is, especially when you look at Brzezinski's 1997, the Grand Chessboard book. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And
I mention it. Yes, I quote from it in my book. David Rockefeller is very prominent in the first half of my book. He and his brother Nelson fostered the career of Henry Kissinger, and then David Rockefeller simultaneously was fostering the career of Zbigniew Brzezinski. So it's amazing that under Republican President Nixon, you had one of the Rockefeller protégés as National Security Advisor, and then when you had a Democrat, Jimmy Carter, you had another Rockefeller protégé. So the Rockefeller influence was very powerful up to that time, but I would not count it as being so important today. And Brzezinski's still around, and he in some ways he talks the way he used to, which is sort of grand design and so on. But in some ways, when he's out of power, I'm very hard on Brzezinski. I have two chapters really about him, in which I'm really very disapproving of his performance as National Security Advisor. But out of power, he's more sane today, and one thing that he has prominently done this year, I agree with, and that is to worry about the possibility of an attack on Iran, which he thinks would be disastrous for America, and I think profoundly would be very disastrous for America. So, he is a human being, and he isn't just uniquely a force for evil. David Rockefeller probably not uniquely a force for evil, but the Rockefeller power certainly helped helped us move in the direction of concentrated power and secret decisions. David Rockefeller talks in his autobiography, and I quote a lot from it in my book, about how when Kissinger wasn't sure he wanted to do anything about Allende in Chile back in 1970, And David Rockefeller came to Washington and told him that he really had to. And in his autobiography, David Rockefeller is very candid about his own role in persuading the White House and the CIA to mount an operation which it certainly got rid of Allende, but it also got rid of democracy in Chile for many years. And as Rockefeller himself admits in his book, it led to a period of terror afterwards. It also led to free market economics, which he approved of, so he was proud of his role. But it's, I think, a very black mark on the history of the United States and Latin America. And believe me, in Latin America, they're not going to forget it for a long, long time.
Oh, no, not at all. And that's exactly right, Professor. I'm actually a documentary filmmaker, and I just released a film called 9/11 New World Rising. And in there, I do cover how Kissinger was basically the front man for David Rockefeller, and the successful coup attempt against Allende that you speak of there was funded not only by the Rockefellers, the CIA, but ITT mines there that had in Chile. And so when you look at these coups, which actually happened on September 11th, 1973, by chance, and like you said, these people are never going to forget this, and this is a constant thing and a constant pattern that you start to see, is these Rockefellers, basically using Kissinger as a front man to, encroach and enforce the United States military to attack these sovereign nations to protect the corporate interests. And, it's interesting also, I think, Professor, that, that Salvador Allende's son was actually going to try Kissinger. They were going to try him for war crimes on September 11th, 2001, the day of. And there's actually a Washington Post article you can read that in. And, of course, it never came to pass because of the events of that day. But how much do you see?
To this day, there are countries Kissinger can't go to in Europe because he knows he faces the risk of being detained and indicted as a war criminal. That's his current status.
Exactly, and that just goes to show you, doesn't really have to take a lot of research to figure out why that is. And as we were discussing Brzezinski, there was an article that came out on CNN this week, on the CNN website. It says Brzezinski, U.S. in danger of stampeding to war with Iran. You alluded to that. And in this article, they basically pit Brzezinski against Kissinger, with Brzezinski saying he thinks it's a bad idea, and of course Kissinger railroading the plan through, because we know, again, this is an attempt to secure oil interests for the Rockefeller family, for ExxonMobil, Dutch Oil, Shell, BP, etc. Can you speak a little bit about the current feuding sides for this coming engagement with Iran?
Well, it's clear that, there are many motives why the United States has got itself involved in Central Asia. Israel is one, which we can't forget. But as I see it, the dominant motive has been oil. And here we come to the Council on Foreign Relations again. The Baker Institute in Texas, in conjunction with the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, held a big conference in 2000, just before the election, on energy policy, and it was a consensus in this group of all the experts. They talked a bit about demand-side solutions, which is what Carter tried to do back in the 70s, to reduce our dependency on foreign oil by getting more efficient automobiles and lower our consumption and so on. That's the demand side. But on the supply side, the consensus of this conference was that the United States had to be prepared to use military force in the Central Asia to maintain control over the oil reserves there. Now, we have to understand that the issue here is not so much getting oil for America, because most of that Middle Eastern oil goes to Europe. What America was interested in, and what this conference was interested in, was maintaining the American ability to control the market as a whole and the conditions under which oil is bought and sold in the world. And a very important factor here is that the American dollar, weak as it is, would be a great deal weaker if it was not for the fact that all OPEC oil at present is bought and sold with dollars, which means that all kinds of countries all over the world which don't have oil and depend on OPEC oil, they have to maintain big dollar reserves in order to buy the oil, even though the oil doesn't come from America. It goes directly from, say, Iraq to, Tanzania or whatsoever. But Tanzania has to have dollars to pay for it, and America is fighting to maintain that. And it's not just the Rockefeller oil interests. There are Texas independents as well. The whole oil scene is interested in maintaining that control. For example, it's obvious that China is going to get more and more oil from Central Asia. But now that the United States has troops in the weirdest places like Kyrgyzstan on the Chinese border and Georgia on the Caspian Sea, and for a while we had them in Uzbekistan until they were asked to leave, and to say nothing of the troops we have in Iraq and in Afghanistan, all of that creates now for the first time a U.S. presence in the part of the world which has the biggest known oil reserves of all at this time. And rightly or wrongly, these oil experts see that as essential to America's future. And as long as we look at the problem that way, troops are never going to leave Iraq. And Gates made that pretty clear yesterday, that we talk about ending the Iraq war is not talking about ending the American presence in Iraq, and he wants to see a permanent presence of something like a quarter the size of what is there today.
Now, you spoke about the different trading and the fact that the oil trading that happens and occurs occurs in American dollars. Now, with the coming U.S. dollar collapse that appears to be happening all around us, I believe it was last week the Canadian dollar traded on par with the American dollar for the first time since 1976, and we know that China has these these huge stocks in American dollars, and it looks to me that they may be getting ready to dump the dollar to start trading oil in the euro. What is your take on how fast, or do you think that's going to happen? And just maybe a few thoughts on how you think that's going to significantly affect the government. Obviously, we know it's going to cause an economic collapse, of which we haven't seen since the Great Depression. But are there any indicators that you see formulating around that from your research that tell you that this is something that is going to happen sooner than later?
Well, there are two different things here. I think the idea that oil will be traded more and more in euros, I think that's already been happening. Ironically, Iraq started to do that, and that was just before we invaded it. And Iran announced that they were going to do it, and that was just before we started threatening Iran. But whatever happens in Iraq and Iran, I think more and more oil definitely will be traded in euros, and that will be another, of course, weakening of the U.S. dollar. But I'm not a catastrophist when it comes to the future of the U.S. dollar. I mean, it's quite true that China could absolutely destroy the U.S. dollar by dumping what they have, but one of the biggest losers, if that were to happen, would be China itself, precisely because they do hold so much of our securities. The same question has been raised not just about China, but about Saudi Arabia. The one reason that America never is too hard on Saudi Arabia and let the Saudi family and the bin Laden family leave America right after 9/11 when no planes were supposed to be in the air, it's because everyone in Washington is very aware that Saudi Arabia could wreck the status of the U.S. dollar, but they too would be huge losers if they were to do that. So I myself, I mean, I see a further weakening of the dollar, but not in a catastrophic way. In some ways, it would be good for America. You know, our dollar is probably overvalued right now, and that's why it's so hard to sell American products overseas. The relationship of China to America today is astonishingly like the relationship of America to Britain between World War I and World War II. Britain's pound was overvalued, and American banking policy helped to keep it high. America cleaned up by invading the markets that British products were now too expensive to compete in. And so without being a major military force in that period, America gained immensely in power because of its increasing control over the world economy. That's what China's playing the same role today. Militarily, it's not very aggressive. No one seriously thinks that China is going to move fiercely. You know, there is the question of Taiwan. There are some issues, some border issues with Russia and India. But basically, China is right now very competitive economically, not much of a threat to anybody militarily, and they're cleaning up economically the way America cleaned up between the wars. I think they would want to preserve that situation and not threaten it by dumping U.S. dollars. It would not be in their interest any more than it would be in ours.
Professor, we're coming up on the half-hour break here. I'd like to use you to stick around with us for the next half hour as well. In the next half hour, when we come back from the break, sir, I'd like to get in a little bit more about your book. We're speaking with Professor Peter Dale Scott. His new book is The Road to 9/11, Wealth, Empire, and the Future of America. It's now available. You can check out his website at peterdalescott.net. Just a great wealth of information, and we're going to continue to talk to him on the other side. When we come back from the break, Professor, I'd like to talk a little bit more about your book and also get you to inform the listeners a little bit about your research into the parallels between the Kennedy assassination and 9/11. So when we get back from the break, that's what we're going to be discussing. You can join us at truthnetradio.com. We have a chat room there. You can click on the link on the left-hand side. Join us in the chat room. You're listening to the Global Reality Radio Hour right here on the TruthNet Radio Network. My name is Josh Reeves, speaking with Peter Dale Scott. Please stick around. We're going to be right back. Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to the Global Reality Radio Hour right here on the TruthNet Radio Network. My name is Josh Reeves. I'm talking to my guest, Peter Dale Scott. He is the author of the new book, 9/11, The Road to 9/11, Wealth, Empire, and the Future of America. He's a writer and researcher, a poet, a very astute and informed gentleman on everything pertaining to history and what we see formulating around the world around us. Professor, I want to ask you a question about your book, and I really wanted to get your take on what you see that is formulated around us. We spoke a bit about the Project for an American Century earlier in the program, and I really wanted to get your take on what you feel is the possibility of another event such as the 9/11 happening within the 21st century, or within the next, recent future, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, as they move one step closer to this blueprint that was laid out in the Project for American Century documents. Do you see a possibility that there may be future events like a 9/11 because of the plan that these people have laid out?
Yes, I do, and I'm not alone. The most immediate concern I have about this is not, say, the next 15 or 20 years, but before the 2008 election. And we have to come back to the question of Iran. We know that the contingency planning which exists for an attack on Iran, which would be primarily an aerial attack that could...
Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to the Global Reality Radio Hour right here on the TruthNet Radio Network. My name is Josh Reeves. I'm talking to my guest, Peter Dale Scott. He is the author of the new book, 9/11, The Road to 9/11, Wealth, Empire, and the Future of America. He's a writer and researcher, a poet, a very astute and informed gentleman on everything pertaining to history and what we see formulating around the world around us. Professor, I want to ask you a question about your book, and I really wanted to get your take on what you see that is formulated around us. We spoke a bit about the Project for an American Century earlier in the program, and I really wanted to get your take on what you feel is the possibility of another event such as the 9/11 happening within the 21st century, or within the next recent future, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, as they move one step closer to this blueprint that was laid out in the Project for American Century documents. Do you see a possibility that there may be future events like a 9/11 because of the plan that these people have laid out?
Yes, I do, and I'm not alone. The most immediate concern I have about this is not, say, the next 15 or 20 years, but before the 2008 election. And we have to come back to the question of Iran. We know that the contingency planning which exists for an attack on Iran, which would be primarily an aerial attack, but could possibly involve nuclear weapons, because it would be an attack on Iran's atomic facilities, some of which are very deeply buried in the ground and would take very major weapons to disable them. Those plans are actually dependent on some kind of 9/11 type event happening. And of all places, the journal Foreign Affairs, which is the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, they had an article in April warning that if there was another 9/11, which appeared to be blamable on Iran, that instead of just attacking Iran the way we went almost immediately into Afghanistan, there should be a very close examination of that event first of all. Now, the point of the article is a bit different from my point, because but what the article was saying made very good sense. They said it would be very much in the interest of Al-Qaeda, which is anti-Shia and therefore anti-Iran. There are at least two major factors in Islam, Sunni and Shia. Al-Qaeda is almost exclusively Sunni. Iran is almost exclusively Shia. And Sunni and Shia have fought many times all through the 1980s. Iraq and Iran were fighting a Sunni government against the Shia government. And so the Foreign Affairs article says it would be in the interest of Al-Qaeda to stage another 9/11, make it look like Iran, and then have America attack Iran, which incidentally would mean they would spend less time in Iraq attacking the Sunnis, who are the cadres for Al-Qaeda. This is a real possibility. But I think that my own analysis of 9/11 is that I don't pretend to understand what really happened on 9/11, but I do have a very strong picture that the relations between Al-Qaeda and American intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, are a good deal closer than the American press has ever let us know, and that in the 1980s, before there was an Al-Qaeda, the CIA was backing the same people in Afghanistan, and in the 1990s, when there was an Al-Qaeda, the CIA was making it possible for terrorist leaders to come into this country on special visas to lead them, and for people to go to, well, I won't blame the CIA here, but somehow somebody who was later convicted as an Al-Qaeda terrorist was able to go to Fort Belvoir, a U.S. Army base, and get a list of Muslim Muslims in the U.S. Army whom he could recruit to take to Bosnia. And we also, Americans, made it possible to move Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda types from Afghanistan into Azerbaijan, where the oil companies wanted a strong anti-Soviet government there. So you had a whole decade in the 1990s of cooperation between American elements and Al-Qaeda, and this raises the question whether some of these Americans may have been in on the planning for 9/11, which I do blame on Al-Qaeda, but I doubt very much could have been planned and carried out by somebody in the cave, Tora Bora, in Afghanistan. So if we raise the question whether Al-Qaeda could stage another event, blame it on Iran, that also raises the question whether people outside Al-Qaeda could back them in that kind of event. I don't think this is going to happen. I say it's a risk. I say it's a matter of great urgency to understand what did happen on 9/11, and it's very clear we don't know to this day. It's very clear that the 9/11 Commission report was a cover-up, and I do, in my book, give some examples of where it's clearly covering up. And particularly, I have to say, covering up on the activities of that day of Vice President Dick Cheney.
Right, and you have, the obvious, omissions. No mention of World Trade Center Building 7.
Not a word about it.
Not a word of Building 7 mentioned in the report. The omissions and distortions are glaringly obvious within that, and it's interesting. As you were talking about, the various usage of Al-Qaeda with the CIA, because we know, as we were talking about Brzezinski before, we know Brzezinski funded and trained Al-Qaeda in the late 70s, and we also know that Osama bin Laden was...
I wouldn't put it... I know what you're talking about, and something Brzezinski did certainly get the ball rolling in Azerbaijan. But in the 1970s, there was not yet an Al-Qaeda. Well, Al-Qaeda, we're talking about, we call them Arab Afghans sometimes, Muslims who came to Afghanistan from other parts of the world and created a sort of foreign legion in Afghanistan. That foreign legion didn't begin until the 1980s, after Brzezinski had left. It didn't become Al-Qaeda really until 1988. What Brzezinski did do, and was a disastrous mistake in my opinion, was to back the Shah and his intelligence network, Savak, in stirring up trouble inside Afghanistan. It was clear Afghanistan was an unstable country. It was leaning more and more to the left, and eventually it had a coup in 1978, but even before it had a coup, Brzezinski and the CIA and Savak were stirring up the reactionary mullah elements in Afghanistan to get them to act against the what we call them communists, and some of them definitely were communists, but it was basically a gap between the urban intellectuals who were university trained and the people in the countryside who were very traditional and practiced an extreme form of Islam. Brzezinski, by stirring things up there in the short run, helped contribute to a communist government, which made him happy because he wanted, in his own words, to give the Soviet Union their own Vietnam, and so then acted against the communist government, and by his provocations helped bring in the Soviet Union in 1979. That's what I blame Brzezinski for, and I think it was a very serious mistake on his part. But it's a little bit different from training Al-Qaeda. I wouldn't say he did that.
We were talking a little bit earlier in the program about these different small cabals within the government. I refer to them as these, what they refer to as black operations, black operators, that sort of thing. In your research, Professor Scott, what have you seen as far as these small cabals that basically work beyond the reach of the commander-in-chief without consent for the aims of things like the Project for New American Century, and what correlations can you give us, because I want to talk about in this segment about your research into the correlations between the Kennedy assassination and 9/11. What, in your research, have you seen in these black operations and the relationship between the Kennedy assassination and 9/11?
Well, can we first of all just deal with the black operations part?
Sure.
When William Casey was Reagan's director of the CIA, and he was a wild man. I mean, by everybody's definition. And he even said that when he came to the CIA, it was to wage war on the Soviet Union. So what Brzezinski had started in Afghanistan, Casey picked up very readily, was very keen on giving a lot of aid to these Islamists in Afghanistan, and he proposed a lot of things which the regular CIA, not just the analysts but even the operatives, warned was dangerous and it could lead to major war. And increasingly, this is where it gets black, he did it on his own outside the CIA by, first of all, talking directly himself personally to the head of Saudi intelligence in Saudi Arabia and the head of Pakistani intelligence and indeed the president of Pakistan, General Zia, and signed on to some very grandiose operations which the regular CIA was opposed to, and some of which were probably illegal in terms of the CIA charter. Now, what's most relevant here is this idea of the Foreign Legion, the Arab Afghans there. This was originally a Saudi-Pakistani project, and the CIA said we shouldn't get involved with it because they're totally anti-American. They were anti-American back in 1980 and made no secret of it. But Casey thought it would be clever to use them in Pakistan and, in Afghanistan. And also, Casey had two other projects, both of which I'm sure were illegal. One was to corrupt the Soviet army by feeding them drugs the way the American army was fed drugs in Vietnam, which we blamed wrongly, I think, on the communists then. And the other was to actually conduct raids inside Uzbekistan, which was then right on the Afghan border, and in those days was part of the Soviet Union. And I believe that they used Uzbeks for these raids. It was Casey's idea. It was not the CIA's idea. And I think he used some of these, when we say Arab Afghans, they obviously weren't Afghan, and many of them were not Arab. Uzbeks were in the Arab Afghans, and I think that he used some of those Uzbeks from the Foreign Legion to go into the Soviet Union. And all of this is happening outside the CIA bureaucracy. And coming back to the drug thing, he's working with something called the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which eventually was brought down as being the world's largest drug money laundering, and even drug trafficking bank, had its own little black operations capacity, provided the infrastructure in the early days for what was happening in Afghanistan, and became very deeply involved with getting drugs out of Afghanistan and into the rest of the world, including the United States. So we had something very bad going on here, which was the result of decisions being made by really a handful of people. And even in you had quite a large covert bureaucracy in the CIA by then, but this covert bureaucracy was opposed to what Casey was doing. So that's why I wanted to bring all that in about black operations.
And it's very interesting, and that's one of the the key aspects to me when you look at this. And people always want to try to assign blame to certain parties, and people, you hear a lot of people want to blame Bush for 9/11 without really any knowledge of these compartmentalized structures that have existed virtually forever in the structure of the United States government, but carry out these operations. You had anything, as you were talking about the Shah, the installation of Savak after they pulled out Mossadegh, a similar situation you saw happen there with the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran. That was, the pretty much the precursor to the installation of Savak, and dovetail of the similar situations that you've seen occur as we were talking about Allende in Chile. But I just wanted to get your take, Professor, on the black operation aspect of 9/11. My position in my book, and I've written some other things. Let me just say to the readers, what I'm about to say isn't all in my book, but I have a website. It's I think you mentioned it, www.peterdalescott.net, and I do go into some of these things there. I say in the book that Cheney should be required to testify for the first time under oath. He has never testified about 9/11 under oath to this day. What particularly concerns me is there were no interceptions of planes on that day, as I imagine everyone listening knows. But up until June of 2001, interceptions were quite normal, there being 67 of them, I think, in the preceding 10 months. And then, as the 9/11 report itself mentions, there was a rule which made it very difficult to intercept on that day. And this was a JCS rule which was instituted on June the 1st, 2001. And as far as I can make out, it was then repealed in December of 2001 because it was a crazy rule, which said that in order to get a military response, and that would mean interception, you had to go to highest authority, which meant either the President or the Secretary of Defense. That had not been the case before. Now, an interception is not a very aggressive thing. A plane goes off course, nobody knows what's happening, but the automatic response is for fighters to go up and get on the wingtips of that plane and try to guide it back or at least find out what's happening. That certainly should have happened on 9/11. There was plenty of time. There was almost 2 hours between the first alarm at about 8:14 and when Flight 93 hit the ground at 10:03 or 10:07 a.m. That's almost 2 hours. They should have been able to have an interception far, far quicker time than that, but there wasn't a single one, and that I think the question of why we got that rule on June the 1st is a very major question, and Mike Rupert, who investigated this and spoke to people inside the Pentagon, drew, I think, the very logical conclusion that it was a result of a task force that Cheney was heading in May. On May the 1st, George Bush put Cheney in charge of a task force to plan responses to a terrorist attack, which really means, in effect, to plan for responses to a 9/11. And 1 month later, we get this new rule, and the report never asked anybody, as far as we can figure out, where that rule came from. So I suspect I suspect something black in that area. That rule was I cannot imagine a sane, helpful, constructive reason for that rule being instituted. I can see it only as constructive to planning for 9/11. Now, I want to get your take, Professor, on the drills that were happening on 9/11. As you know, they were flying. As
many as 6, and they involve phantom aircraft, which means injects, they call them at NORAD, that NORAD would see on their screens a blip that was moving off course. Now, of course, the planes that were hijacked were blips moving off course, but there were also other blips moving off course which did not correspond to planes at all. They were what they call injects, something which another source was putting in to test NORAD on its ability to respond. The report, 9/11 report, talks about one of these drills or war games. Counting all the exercises and games, There were about 6. And some of them involved, again, FEMA, an agency that Cheney had been involved with for 20 years. One of them was actually just outside Dulles Airport, saying what would happen if a plane actually hit the headquarters of the agency that was it was part of the NSA. It could be just a coincidence, but it's certainly something to be investigated. And once again, Mike Rupert thinks, and I'm not sure I agree with him, but there's a case to be made that Cheney was the man responsible for the war games as well. So, you know, the report gives you a picture of total confusion and anarchy that day in Washington. I think the reality was there was very centralized control, and that the man at the center of the controls was Cheney, consulting regularly with Donald Rumsfeld, something which the report says didn't happen, but which Rumsfeld himself says did happen. So those are the things we have to look at.
Well, in the last few minutes we have left here in the program, Professor Scott, I just wanted to get your take on Building 7. Fell at 5:18 in the afternoon and wasn't hit by an airplane under very suspicious circumstances. There's been quite a few videos that have come out, you know, where you have first responders and fire and police telling people to stand back, the building's about to blow up. BBC reporting that the building had fell 23 minutes prior to it falling, when you can visibly see it in the background. What is your take on the suspicious circumstances regarding World Trade Center Building 7?
Well, I can't add much to what you just said. Everything you just said is very relevant. I have only one paragraph on World Trade Center in my book, and I just bring it in because here was Bush did not want a 9/11 commission at all. He opposed the idea of a major investigation, and it was the families of the victims who insisted on one, and particularly there were these so-called Jersey girls who went to Washington, lobbied, and they built up a large majority in both houses of Congress to get it passed. And then, when the commission was appointed, the two co-chairs, Keene, who's a Republican, and Hamilton, who's a Democrat, they were on CBS and gave highest praise to the Jersey girls. Said, they've given us all the right questions. We're going to answer their questions. One of their first questions was about WTC-7. They never answered it. Another one, this deserves more than a paragraph, is that the FBI had a list of the hijackers before 10 a.m. on September the 11th. This is amazing because at 10 a.m. the final plane had not yet crashed. And then in the next 2 or 3 weeks you had people popping up in the Middle East saying, oh yes, that's my name, that's my photograph. I did go to that flight school, but I obviously wasn't on a plane because here I am still alive in the Middle East. And the head of the FBI said there are obviously some problems about the identity that we still have to clear up. So you expect the 9/11 report to clear them up, but instead they just assume that the original list from 10 a.m. on September 11th is the accurate one, as if there had never been any problems raised about it. You couldn't have more glaring evidence that they're trying to sweep the embarrassing issues under the rug.
I agree fully there, Professor. Our guest this evening is Peter Dale Scott. His new book is The Road to 9/11, Wealth, Empire, and the Future of America. You can check out his website at peterdalescott.net. Just a wealth of information. And we hope to have you back on in the future again, Professor. Thank you so much for being on the program with us.
Thank you very much, Josh. I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much, and I will be in contact with you, and maybe we can get you up a speaking engagement set here in Dallas, Texas. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it on our program this evening. You're listening to the Global Reality Radio Show. You can check out my website at myspace.com/The Global Reality Show. You can email me at globalrealityshow@gmail.com. This program runs Monday to Thursday, 6 to 7 p.m. Central, 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern. We'll see you back here on the program on Monday. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Josh Reeves, listening to the TruthNet Radio Network. Thanks a lot. Stick around for the Live Free or Die radio program with Lee Rogers coming up next. You guys have a great weekend. Take care.